Good evening. This is Diane Sayre, and welcome to the New York Symposium with Diane Sayre. I am the LaRouche candidate running for U.S. Senate against Chuck Schumer, and it bears repeating, and everyone listening should repeat it, because Chuck Schumer is trying desperately to pretend that there is no election, or certainly at least that he is not up for re-election, which he is emphatically up for re-election. So, and he should be defeated because he is definitely one of the perpetrators, advocates for major confrontation between the United States and Russia and the United States and China. He's never met a war that he didn't want to fund and that he didn't love advocating for or being involved in. Now, I had the opportunity today to be a guest along with Scott Ritter on a YouTube channel begun by Cynthia Pooler of Albany, New York. We're going to watch a little bit of that. For those of you who don't know who Scott Ritter is, he is a former Marine intelligence officer, former UN weapons inspector, and an expert actually on the Soviet Union, where he was deployed in the late 80s to oversee the INF treaty compliance. So watching missiles going in and out of factories, or whatever you call the facilities where they make them, that's what he did. So he has a highly qualified view of the situation there, and he, like myself, was on the Ukrainian hit list, otherwise known as a blacklist, but you'll hear what we have to say about that there. There's one development today which I think is very important. People may have heard about this. I think it's a very good breakthrough, which demonstrates, frankly, the goodness in the American people, which we have to liberate and the elected government has to represent, which is the letter from 77 members of the 9/11 families saying that the money that Joe Biden wants to steal from the people of Afghanistan, that's held in the New York branch of the Federal Reserve and is actually the money of the Afghan Central Bank, that although Biden was going to give them $3.5 billion of it and $3.5 billion to various and sundry relief organizations, they said this is the money of the Afghan people. They should have the money. We don't want to be party to starvation in that country. They need it. I just am very pleased by this, because these families certainly have suffered. They could be bitter and ruthless, but instead you see a compassion for the suffering of people, which unfortunately we lack too much in the corridors of power in the United States. So with that said, I'm just going to go to this interview and it'll speak for itself. So let's see here. Okay. Yep.
Welcome to Issues That Matter. I'm Cynthia Pooler. I'm delighted to have two great guests this morning, Scott Ritter and Diane Sayre, who's running for the U.S. Senate in New York. So both of you were lucky enough to get on a certain list. Scott, you want to talk about it, and then Diane can talk about it?
Well, ladies before gentlemen, Diane, you're the senatorial candidate. I yield to you.
Thank you. Yes, we were both on a list which initially had 78 people, and then somehow 6 of them came off it. I don't know exactly why or how. 72 people. The first 31 people on the list had spoken at a conference sponsored by the Schiller Institute of Helga Zepp LaRouche, actually a couple of conferences, and the topic of the conferences was how to resolve these situations without war. And I can assure you that everybody who spoke there did not agree with each other on everything. In fact, they added to the list a farmer, a cattle farmer from Kansas, who was talking about the question of food shortages. But according to the Ukrainian Center for Disinformation, Countering Disinformation, apparently if you want to feed people, you might be a war criminal. So it's really over the top. And then the others are very prominent people like Scott, who's well known for exposing the truth on various matters that have led us into wars which are really not justified or legal, frankly. Tulsi Gabbard, Rand Paul, people internationally who belong with think tanks, who have written articles that are very well informed on the history of the region and have another perspective. So clearly they want, what you see is a policy of wanting this war to continue. And I think the relevant question, and Scott can say more about this, is are members of the US Congress, and specifically Chuck Schumer, my opponent in November, funding a foreign organization in a foreign country to wage smear campaigns against, in this case, his political opponent, and also against American citizens, where we are supposed to have freedom of speech. So maybe you can't get rid of freedom of speech entirely in the United States, although they're doing a pretty good job of that. You can have someone from overseas eliminate freedom of speech. And also, I will say, as a public figure candidate, although they are trying mightily to black out my campaign, but it's not working because I'm on the ballot, I definitely feel my security is at risk. I mean, we're talking about neo-Nazis. We see what just happened here in New York with Salman Rushdie. So I think it's highly irresponsible. I think the Congress has to respond. The Schiller Institute just sent a letter, which both Scott and I signed with about a dozen other, the Americans on this list, to Congress, demanding an investigation of whether the funds that we are giving to Ukraine are going to this agency, which is attacking the First Amendment rights and endangering American citizens. So I'll stop with that. I'm sure you have more to add.
Scott?
Well, first of all, salute to Diane for standing firm in the face of adversity. She's 100% correct. This isn't just about the suppression of free speech, which of course in and of itself is a huge issue. But the day that this list was released, I believe it was July 14th, at a roundtable conference held in Kiev by the Center for Countering Disinformation. That roundtable was organized by a congressionally funded non-governmental organization. That's an American non-governmental organization, and attended by State Department personnel. So this isn't a case of just the United States using U.S. taxpayer money to pay the salaries and underwrite, the creation of this Center for Countering Disinformation, who then published a list with American names on it, calling them Russian propagandists. This is about the United States organizing this, that the United States is conducting this, that the United States is using a foreign proxy in an effort to intimidate and silence American citizens for daring to speak truth to a very complex issue. Apparently, if you embrace fact-based truth, you are a Russian propagandist. But it goes beyond this, because at the same meeting that Diane, myself, Ray McGovern, Tulsi Gabbard, Rand Paul, and others were labeled Russian propagandists, we were also labeled information terrorists, and that the goal of this center should be getting international support to have us arrested and prosecuted as war criminals. Now, I don't give a flying you-know-what about these labels. You want to try and arrest me, Ukraine? Bring it on, buddy. I've spent my entire life preparing for creeps like you. Diane's a political figure. Diane's running for office. And as she said, there are enough lunatics out there, including here in the state of New York, pro-Ukrainian groups loyal to the ideology of Stepan Bandera. If you drive right down here to the Catskills, you will see on the side of the road the flag of the Bandera movement, the flag of Right Sector, the flag of the Azov regiment, flying proudly. So there are people out there who can very easily take as a cue the labeling of a prominent political figure, one who is in opposition to Chuck Schumer, who has apparently just gone all in for the neo-Nazi regime of Volodymyr Zelensky. And who knows what they do. I'm not going to talk any more about it because I don't want to give anybody any ideas. But Diane's right. This is a safety and security issue above and beyond a free speech issue. But the free speech issue is of huge concern, not only in terms of using a foreign proxy funded by American taxpayer dollars to label Americans exercising their right of free speech as Russian propagandists. That has a chilling effect. I can tell you right now that I have been denied employment opportunities because of that very label. I am a freelance writer. I published in a number of outlets. And some of those outlets have said, we can't publish you anymore because you are a Russian propagandist. So it has a chilling impact on that. Not, you know, and then of course there's the security impact of being labeled an information terrorist at a time when the official policy of the United States is to kill terrorists. So, you know, this is extraordinarily problematic. Now, the list has come down. They've taken it off. And I give kudos to Diane for organizing events outside of Chuck Schumer's office. I'd like to believe that the letters I wrote to Schumer, to Gillibrand, and to Paul Tonko had a role in this, although I did get a response from Paul Tonko, which was a ridiculous form letter that didn't address any of the issues that I talked about. It literally explained why he supports Ukraine. But, you know, the list has come down, but the money is still there. The fact is, there was a meeting on July 14th organized by the United States government, an NGO funded by the U.S. government, attended by U.S. State Department personnel that set this in motion. So it's not good enough that the list came down. We need the United States government to cease and desist the funding of this effort and to publicly distance itself from the work performed by the Center of Countering Disinformation, to include saying that no one on that list is a Russian propagandist, no one on that list is an information terrorist, no one on that list deserves to be arrested and prosecuted for war crimes. Everybody on that list, especially the Americans, were exercising their First Amendment right to speak freely. That's what we need the U.S. government to do. That's what we need the State Department to do. That's what we need Chuck Schumer to do.
Scott, two questions. How could anybody call you a war criminal when you're working for peace? I don't understand that.
Well, you say working for peace. Let me just make it clear. I am not a pacifist. I'm a former Marine. My job was war. What I do say is that I know war firsthand, and I hate war. I abhor war. You know, the analogy that I use, it's sort of tongue-in-cheek, but it's true. I love dogs. I think dogs are the greatest thing in the world. But if a rabid dog enters my neighborhood, I am going to Atticus Finch him. Okay, that's a reference to Kill a Mockingbird, and that means I'm shooting the rabid dog. There are rabid dogs in this world who need to be shot. And as a Marine, I was prepared to do that difficult task on behalf of my country and defense of my nation. But I recognize that war is horrible and should be avoided at all costs. However, in the current conflict in Ukraine, I am not advocating peace at all. I am 100% on the side of justice. And justice is the sole purview of Russia in this regard. They were forced to carry out this war. I believe that Russia had no alternative but to carry out this conflict. I believe that facing down neo-Nazi nationalists who have the blood of hundreds of thousands of people on their hands. I'm not just talking about the 14,000 people murdered in Donbass. I'm talking about 120,000 Poles, 220,000 Russians that were slaughtered by the Banderist movement back in the 1950s, funded by the CIA, by the way. So no, I'm not a pacifist in this case. I think rabid dogs need to be shot. And right now, Ukraine is full of rabid dogs. I know Diane and you might disagree with me, but I just wanted to make it clear. I am not on the side of peace in this case. I think there is a horrific threat to international peace and security that resonates across Europe and the United States. This is the same ideology that my relatives went across the Atlantic to fight and destroy back in World War II. And it's alive and it's well and it's living today in Ukraine. So I'm not a pacifist in this regard. Now, if that makes me a Russian propagandist, that's a label that people can throw out there, but I'm not a Russian propagandist. I'm as critical of Russia as anybody when it comes to certain things. But in the issue of Ukraine and whether or not Russia had a responsibility, a duty, and a right to defend the Russian ethnic population of Eastern Ukraine from the horrific crimes being perpetrated against them by neo-Nazi Banderists, yeah, I'm on the side of Russia on this one.
Would you concur, Diane?
Well, I want to make a point on this disinformation question. I mean, first of all, the United States played a despicable role. I mean, you can go back to 2014 when the Obama administration and Victoria Nuland overthrew the government of Ukraine. And we have the phone call with the ambassador, Payet, where they decide exactly who's going to be in the government. So anyone saying that Ukraine had any independence from the United States is just not telling the truth. We also know, by the way, that Christopher Steele, then MI6 of the infamous Steele dossier, actually wrote close to 100 memoranda to Nuland and the State Department about, so you see the old British great game, British geopolitics, which unfortunately has taken over our policy. We're not acting like the United States. But even, all right, suppose the coup happened, then they had this Minsk process. The United States could have supported that. Had we supported that, we would never have come to this. So there were many, many turning points in the road where this could have been prevented. And we created the conditions. My hypothesis, Scott can say if this is that the reason why the Biden administration was so precise or attempted to be on which day Putin was going to invade Ukraine was because they were planning the escalation in the Donbass. And I think they launched like 1,600 shells on Donetsk. And I mean, there was a certain offensive of this Nazi-infested military against the Donbass, which was planned for a certain day. And therefore they said, oh, the Russian invasion is going to occur a certain day, and not mentioning the provocation.
Scott, I got a question for you. You know, I remember you from the early 2000s when you were outspoken against WMDs. At that point, when you were talking about no WMDs, was there as much pressure as there is now in what you're experiencing?
Well, to be frank, I mean, the pressure that, the only pressure I feel today is the pressure of rejected employment opportunity. I don't feel any pressure from the U.S. government. I don't have FBI agents tailing me around, knocking on my door, harassing my family. I had all that back in the early 2000s. I mean, the pressure back then was real. It was significant. It was oppressive. But they had warned me. I mean, I don't want to get too graphic, but when I resigned from my position as a weapons inspector at the United Nations, the CIA station in New York told me at the time that the FBI is going to, and he used a bad word, and he indicated a place on my anatomy that they were going to do this to me. He said, just understand that that will happen. And that night, the FBI made a phone call to Dan Rather, and on national TV, I was accused of being an Israeli spy charged with espionage. The specific charges carried the death penalty. And that was all the FBI is doing. Then the FBI proceeded to carry out a campaign of defamation against me. So, no, it was very oppressive back then. I don't have any of that going on right now. What I have right now is the chilling impact of being labeled a Russian propagandist at a time when the United States has fallen into a McCarthy-like knee-jerk reaction against anything Russia. This is the new Red Scare. So, there is a difference. And fortunately, I do have outlets that continue to allow me to write, and I earn an income from that, so my family is not suffering. And like I said, I carry the labels sort of tongue in cheek because I'm at the state in life where I don't care about what people think about me anymore. I mean, if you like me, I'm happy. If you don't like me, I don't care. And so if you want to call me a name, call me a name. It's like water off a duck's back. But just don't attack my family. If you want to take a swing at me, that's your business. Please don't. But if you do, understand there will be consequences. And do not bother Diane Sayre. I mean, whether you agree with her politics or not, and I happen to agree with much of what Diane Sayre stands for, I think she would be a fantastic representative of the people of New York in the United States Senate. And God, we could only hope to have somebody of her, wisdom and maturity there. But if you don't agree with her, vote against her. Okay, that's what Americans do. Vote against her. But don't attack her. Don't fall into this trap of allowing labels to dictate, outcomes that nobody wants. So, Diane, I'm 100% behind you. And I will continue to fight this ridiculous label that they put on you. I can't predict the future, but I can tell you that, there are alternatives that are available if the Congress continues to refuse to act. And one of those alternatives is perhaps filing an injunction at federal court to freeze all U.S. taxpayer money going to Ukraine, until which time the question of how this money is being spent, and is this money being spent to suppress the rights of Americans and to target Americans for potential physical harm, is finally answered by the U.S. government.
Okay, so I think you get a sense of that. I want to emphasize there's more, and I would really encourage people to watch the video. It's on my Facebook page, it's on the LaRouche organization page, it's on the Schiller Institute, and Cynthia Pooler requests that people subscribe to her YouTube channel and get other of her interviews. She interviews Scott Ritter frequently, and she's interviewed me a few times. Now, this question of elections and meddling in elections and harassing and defaming candidates is exactly what happened in the case of LaRouche, and we discussed that last week. I would like Jose to just play another short clip from the hearings of the Commission to Investigate Human Rights Violations in the United States on from LaRouche's attorney, Odin Anderson, with a very pungent comment from Mr. LaRouche at the end. And then we're going to look at a leaflet that I've written that we want to get out, and go also to Suzanne Klebe, my campaign coordinator, who has some things to say about what's happening in the Trump case with the Espionage Act. But let's first of all remind ourselves of one of the most important precedents for what we see today and what happened with the LaRouche case.
This is the most incredible piece of FBI material, one of the most incredible pieces of FBI material that I've ever seen. And
CPUSA.
we're Communist Party. I'm going to get it. That's the Communist Party of the United States. What this suggests is that the Communist Party has let the FBI know that they want to eliminate Lyndon LaRouche for their political reasons. They consider him to be a politically dangerous person, and the Communist Party wants to eliminate him. If you look at the bottom, New York proposes submitting a blind memorandum to the Daily World, to foster these efforts. Here's the FBI climbing in bed with the Communist Party in order to effect the elimination of Lyndon LaRouche from the political scene. I think we all know what that means. Henry Kissinger, who we all know by name and some probably remember by reputation and actions, was a very powerful man. Mr. LaRouche took exception with his policies, which he considered to be genocidal, got into a serious row with Mr. Kissinger. And Mr. Kissinger writes to William Webster, the director of the FBI. Here is, within the short period thereafter, Buck Revell, who was the head of counterintelligence for the FBI at the time, is sent this memorandum by William Webster, who was contacted by David Abshire of PIFIAB. That's the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. And these same parties, Henry Kissinger and his colleagues, are now raising before PIFIAB the question as to whether LaRouche, because he seems to have funding from sources that they don't understand, is possibly operating as a foreign intelligence agent, and they want them to look into this. Now, what that does, and the words are bad enough, but the reality is terrifying. This triggers Executive Order 12333, which allows virtually any form of conduct, any activity, to be undertaken as long as it's under this national security cover. So this was the beginning of a national security covered operation against Mr. LaRouche and his colleagues.
So my case is important in the sense it's more extensive, it's more deep-going, long-going. But when it came to getting me, it was the same apparatus that I find, in my opinion, was used in these other cases. And that until we remove from our system of government a rotten, permanent bureaucracy which acts like contract assassins, using the authority of the justice system to perpetrate assassination, this country is not free, nor anyone in it.
Thank you. So he was absolutely correct, and we've seen how the FBI and the Department of Justice are used to silence political thought, and that is real, or candidacy, or political choice, I should say, in the United States. That is really the purpose of the FBI raid on Mar-a-Lago. And people watching can say, you love Donald Trump, you hate Donald Trump, but I hope none of you want the Department of Justice and the FBI to dictate to you whom your candidates are going to be, whom you are allowed to vote for, because that's what you see with this. So I have drafted a statement for mass distribution about this question, really, of the consent of the governed. I'm just going to show it here in a second. I can get, sorry, hold on. Have to do another screen share. Because the idea is this will be coming off the printer in 250,000 copies midweek. And everybody in the state of, what we want to have is a blitz effect, not trickle them out over time, but basically over the 26th through 28th, that is a week from today, over the 3 days of that weekend, get out 250,000 of these leaflets in the state of New York. And that's a very tall order. It took us 6 weeks to get 66,000 signatures, which meant that we probably talked to 250,000 people or so, but that was over 6 weeks. So I'm talking about doing something quite extraordinary, and we'll discuss this at the end of the meeting. But you can think about it. So I'm going to just show you here what this statement is. And here it is. The title is Stop the City of London's and Wall Street's Fascist Coup. I can make it even a little bigger. Russia, China, India, and the farmers and truckers of the world are your allies. And then it begins, the August 8th FBI raid on former President Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate has sparked indignation across the so-called political spectrum. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene has moved to impeach Attorney General Merrick Garland, and former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo has correctly pointed out that unless there's a very compelling reason for this apparent violation of due process, the January 6th investigation will lose all credibility. And I add, did it ever have any? Raiding the home of a former president of the United States is unprecedented and is an assault on the institution of the presidency. It's tantamount to a coup against our constitutional form of government. And this is precisely what former Bank of England head Mark Carney demanded in 2019 during his visit to a meeting of central bankers at Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Carney called for regime change, whereby central bankers would supersede governments. Only a fool would think that this regime change was intended for the United States alone. The central banker's intention is that every self-respecting government must be overthrown. That emphatically includes the powerful central government of China, with its 1.4 billion people and a 5,000-year history of city building and scientific progress, as well as the government of Russia's Vladimir Putin, who successfully liberated his nation from the free trade genocidal looting of Mark Carney's friends in the 1990s. It also includes India, which just celebrated its 75th anniversary of independence from the British Empire. And this is very important, and I don't want people to brush it off. As odd as it may seem, even the nasty and clueless President Joe Biden is a target of this operation. Have no doubt that the Mar-a-Lago raid was a message to him too. Recall that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi recently flew on a rage-driven broomstick. That's going to be our new form of energy if we can't get our nuclear power plants back. A rage-driven broomstick to Taiwan to provoke war with China, in spite of a feeble Biden saying it was, quote, not a good idea, unquote. The message is, presidents don't run nations, central bankers do, and you will do as we say or else, unquote. And that's really what we're up against. And you see here a picture, which is from 1986, when 400 FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, armored vehicle carriers, helicopters, showed up at LaRouche's home and then the offices of LaRouche's publications to seize millions of documents. They actually had the intent to assassinate LaRouche, but that did not happen, happily. And of course, as I say here, this is why I declared my candidacy against Senator Chuck Schumer. It was Schumer speaking to Rachel Maddow on January 3rd, 2017, who said President-elect Donald Trump was, quote unquote, dumb to go after the FBI and other intelligence agencies because they had, quote, 6 ways from Sunday to get back at you, unquote, if you dared to attempt to rein in their power. Okay, and there's more to that. And that leaflet is on the website now, but I would like people to think about it. We will have depots around the state where you can pick up 500 copies, 1,000 copies, whatever you think you can get out in that area, or you're welcome, of course, to print them yourself. And hopefully soon we'll have a Spanish language version available of it on the website. So with that said, I would like to go to Suzanne Klebe, who has some things to tell us about what's happening now in the Espionage Act.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to add a few points on this, which cohere with what Diane just did in terms of discussing the leaflet and the statement about whether or not what you're looking at is a shift in the whole concept of what was the US government now into the hands of Mark Carney and this financial apparatus, which has more or less announced that governments are increasingly irrelevant. It's important to think that with the money going into Ukraine, there has been no discussion of a declaration of war, which is the responsibility of the U.S. Congress. They simply, have not even discussed it. At most they discuss how much they're going to send. In the target list of the people who were on the hit list of the Ukrainian Disinformation Network, Rand Paul was on there simply because he called for an audit of the 40 billion that was being sent to Ukraine. As we reported in last week, when CBS tried to do a report saying that less than 1/3 of those weapons actually reached the front line, they were forced to take that off. Now, it's interesting to think of who could have the power. I mean, could Zelensky call the CBS and say, you have to take this story off the air? Or are you dealing with something very, very different in terms of this intelligence apparatus, which is determining both the flow of information and also dissolving the responsibility of government, such as the fact that Congress, it's the responsibility of Congress to declare war. And that's supposed to be because the population is supposed to have something to do with it. In other words, the voters are supposed to be able to communicate to their elected officials what we're doing. Now, this all comes down to the raid in Mar-a-Lago and the coverage of this, because as people know, the search warrants were put in under the authority of 18 U.S.C. 793, which is the Espionage Act of 1917. So that was the so-called legal reason for this raid, and saying that there were classified material, and the whole story on this thing. But as it said, I mean, this is unprecedented. This is a direct attack on the power of the presidency itself. It's both sides of the political spectrum realize this represents a very fundamental shift. And our point on it is the following, that it's the presidency under attack because what you're watching is a move to basically dissolve governments altogether, number one. Number two, if you look into the history of the Espionage Act, which is what I want to give a little bit of material on, it has nothing to do with whether material is classified or not classified. In 1917, the reason the Espionage Act was pushed was to get support for the U.S. going into World War I and going in on the side of the British. And it was made illegal to attack the British at that time because we were allied with the British in this war. That was the whole way this thing was set up. And so the idea was that if you're an ally of the British, you can't attack the British because that would be against your national defense. And the Espionage Act was passed in a way that had draconian penalties to anybody who would both try to discourage going into the war and also who would print material opposing what was happening in the war. So if you show the first slide here, Jose. The first slide is, in fact, Woodrow Wilson. Let me see. I can't see it, but you can see it here. Well, let me see. Can I make this bigger so I can see what the slide is? Okay, can you show it again? All right. So, well, Wilson, I can't see the slide myself, but the point is that okay, here it is. He ran in 1916 as a peace candidate. He had been president, and the slogan was, he kept us out of war. But by in April 1917, he moved to get the US into the war, to get a declaration of war. He said this would be the war to end all wars, and that it would make the world safe for democracy. And this reference to democracy should remind people of what we're hearing now about somebody like Zelensky, who supposedly we're supporting in Ukraine, who has dissolved, I think it's something like 15 opposition parties, maybe the number's wrong, also dissolved a number of newspapers. So, you know, you get the contradiction here. But the next slide, no, the next slide is the cover of the book. The next, this is a book that was written by a Brooklyn historian, which really puts what happened around this Patriot Act, the Espionage Act, I think in a very important light. Because on the one hand, and I'm going to read some quotes to it about the Espionage Act itself. On the one hand, they passed this to get the US into the war on the side of the British. They then went after everybody who opposed it in a way that, was, I think you'll find really surprising. And then the question was not just that the US would get into the war, but the other question was that the US would change its self-conception as a nation, as the United States, and which had fought a revolution against British colonialism, that we would begin to actually adopt British conceptions, that we would become part of the British Empire in the process of this war. And the Espionage Act was designed to punish anybody who opposed that shift. And I think it's important to think about this now, because the Espionage Act, as it's been used recently, has a very similar character to it, which is, on the one hand, it doesn't so much go after spies anymore as much as it goes after whistleblowers. And the whistleblowers quite often are people who are documenting that the US is following policies which are completely contrary to our history and to our sense of values. One of the early uses of the Espionage Act in 1971 was to try to stop the publication of the Pentagon Papers, which of course showed the fraud of what was happening in Vietnam. It's been used against Julian Assange. It's been used right now. One of the people who's in prison under the Espionage Act, David Hale, was prosecuted for exposing the use of drones and the military's actual documentation that this was useless militarily. But Hale himself, who was in the military, could no longer stand morally using these drones to kill innocent people. So he's in prison. So you ask yourself, what is the Espionage Act actually doing in its contention that somehow this is in the interest of US national defense, when we don't even determine what our concept of national defense is? And also, frankly, we're not even determining what we think the role of the United States should be. But people are being punished if they oppose what seems to be a particular policy that's coming from someplace out of the country. So if you put that slide back up, Jose, this book that was written by Edwin Burroughs takes on this whole question, and he does it in a very interesting way, because Burroughs is he passed away a couple of years ago, but he was a major historian. He wrote the book Gotham, which people might have seen, and he asked this question about a monument that's in Fort Greene Park in Brooklyn. And the monument is to the American revolutionaries who died in the British prison ships that were docked there off Brooklyn. More people died in those prison ships than died in the revolution itself, on the battlefield. The conditions were horrific. It was brutal. So he wrote this book and he said, well, I'm an important historian. Why is it that I didn't know about this? So he said, well, okay, could be it didn't happen. So then he goes through in the book and he shows, no, there's massive documentation. Then he goes through, whether or not it was well known. And again, it was very prominently known. In fact, in Europe, Lafayette and Ben Franklin talked about this and said that this was one of the reasons, because of the British brutality, that there could never be a realignment. It had a huge impact, the deaths in these prison ships. And then he poses another question. He says, well, one of the reasons it's not known is because of the Espionage Act. And he goes through this and he said what happened was it became illegal to attack what the British did in the revolution. Under the Espionage Act, people were actually put in prison for attacking the policies of the British at that time. So he goes through this in some detail, and he shows that it resulted not only in people being put in prison and being prosecuted, but also changing the history books themselves. He actually goes through this, the way the whole narrative, as you say, about the American split from the British Empire was basically written out in the history books themselves. He then closes the book with another theory, which I think should be shocking to Americans to think about it, because this book was written around the time of the Abu Ghraib scandal. And he said, well, maybe one of the reasons we don't know about it is because we've become so much like them in the use of torture. So he goes through that. But I'm going to show a couple of quotes from the book here, and then show one of the people who was actually prosecuted under the Espionage Act. And I'll tell you who it is. There was a film made during that period of going into the war, and the film was called The Spirit of 76. And the film goes through the revolution, and it shows a particular massacre, which was in Cherry Valley, New York. And this was, the British were involved in this massacre. The Indian groups who were allied with the British were involved, and it was really brutal. So this film was made, and it was shown, and the filmmaker, Goldstein, was prosecuted under the Espionage Act. And I'll show you some of the things that happened on this. The irony, Burroughs points out, is that the prosecution had the following title: The United States Government versus the Spirit of 76. That was the title of the court case. And so if you go into the next slide here, you'll see what Burroughs says about it. First, he just talks about the declaration of war, where the US became the British de facto ally, prompted by the Anglophobia simmering among Americans of Irish and German descent. Now remember, the Easter Rebellion and the attempt of Irish independence was 1916, and then again in 18 and 19. So this was an intense period of opposition to the British colonialism, and the United States was supposed to be the beacon of opposition of British policy. So he goes on, he says there was intense pressure from President Woodrow Wilson, who, by the way, was a famous Anglophile. Congress quickly followed up the declaration of war with passage of the Espionage Act. This harsh and sweeping measure made it a federal offense, punishable by death or by a stiff fine and up to 30 years in jail, to publish or utter anything that would tend to aid the enemy, interfere with recruiting, or promote insubordination and disloyalty in the armed forces. The Sedition Act of 1918, this followed and was later reversed, would extend these provisions to prohibit disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the government. So of course, you think maybe Diane is guilty of this. Continue the next slide. A wave of prosecutions ensued, leaving no doubt that the Wilson administration intended to suppress all anti-war and anti-British feeling in the country. Hundreds of radicals went to prison. 75 newspapers, many written for German American or Irish American newspapers, were either banned from the mails or forced to stop publishing war news. Next slide. British propaganda mills, meanwhile, flooded the United States with lurid descriptions of German war crimes, paeans to Anglo-Saxon democracy. Okay, here's the shift, right? And amiable references to the American Revolution. One writer dubbed it a single regrettable incident caused by the most muddle-headed ministry that ever mismanaged the affairs of Great Britain. But no big deal. In books, pamphlets, lectures, and college classrooms, leading academic historians encouraged Americans to see that their ancient animosity for the British stemmed from ignorance and prejudice. Publishers scrambled to correct the nation's history texts accordingly, rewriting passages that seemed critical of Britain or had good things to say about Germany. In New York, the annual observance of Evacuation Day was quietly discontinued. Evacuation Day was a very big celebration down at Battery Park when the British were finally forced to leave. Next slide. The danger of recollecting British atrocities during the Revolution became apparent only a month after the US declaration of war, when a 14-reel epic film called The Spirit of 76 premiered in Chicago. In April 1918, arguments in the aptly titled case of United States versus The Spirit of 76 got underway in Los Angeles. 2 weeks later, the jury found Goldstein, who made the film, guilty on all counts except conspiracy to commit treason. Judge Bledsoe sentenced the producer to 10 years in a federal penitentiary and imposed a fine of $5,000. Goldstein's mistake, the judge observed caustically, was that he, quote, sought to arouse enmity against Great Britain by seeking to prove that 100 years ago, that nation had been guilty of the same class of atrocities as are now charged against the detestable Huns. And then the last slide. This is a cover of a book written by a very famous film historian who went and got all the records of the trial, Robert Goldstein and The Spirit of 76. So this is the Patriot, I'm sorry, I keep calling it, but it actually is related to the Patriot Act. This is the Espionage Act. And if you think about it, this is being used now in the Trump case. It was used, around questions of documents that the president certainly has a right to have, whether they're classified, unclassified. The actual question is twofold. One is the insistence that the US continue to go into these British-led wars, which have been devastating us, through the whole reign of this. Ever since 9/11 in particular. It also is a move to continue to have Americans lose their sense of our own history and continue to shift the US into this idea of British colonial and British war policy, and ultimately into a situation where you basically have no government at all because you've shifted the paradigm outside of the control of the institutions of government. So I think it's particularly appropriate that Diane's leaflet really goes after this. But if you think about the idea that you have a push right now to say that the US is in a war, it's undeclared, but anybody criticizing the war can be attacked in the same way under the this idea of this legislation and be threatened as a war criminal. And of course, in the case of LaRouche, when they went after LaRouche on this, he was the most vocal person in reasserting the American system idea against this idea of British colonialism. And this itself was considered the actual crime. So that's what I have.
Great, thanks a lot. So, and if people have been listening through the whole program, you heard what Scott Ritter said about what happened to him in 2003, where he came forward as a former UN weapons inspector and said that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction. And he was told that the FBI was going to do him in, basically, and then actually put him on trial for being an Israeli spy, which could have carried the death penalty. I mean, that is really pretty chilling. We are now at an extreme point because, for example, and this comes up later in the interview that I did with Scott, the Ukrainian military has been shelling the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and their nuclear waste is above, it's contained, but it's above ground. If that area is hit with some kind of missile, you're looking at something perhaps worse than Chernobyl. A very serious radiation contamination danger. The Russians went to the UN Security Council to demand action and were met with absurd proposals, as from France, which said, well, why don't you just leave and let the Ukrainians take back over when the Ukrainians are the ones shelling it? Guterres, the UN Secretary General, said, well, we should have peacekeeping forces go in there, you should come out, etc. There's just such a denial. And the point of these lies and the enforcement of the lies is that they propel us to be marched into war. I mean, nuclear war. We're in war already. We are a co-belligerent of the Ukrainian Nazi regime in attacking Russia. We're supplying them the weapons, we're supplying them the personnel, and apparently we're doing the targeting. And the New York Times revealed that, or we bragged, I don't know if it's true, but we had people in the US bragging that we helped the Ukrainians assassinate 12 Russian generals. Well, if that's true, we are definitely a co-belligerent. And Americans should thank their lucky stars that Putin is so moderate and hasn't succumbed to various hotheads. I'm sure he's under intense pressure to be much more rash than he has been. It's just an extremely dangerous situation. But I think what you just went through, Suzanne, is really something, because you wonder, why can't we attack the British? Right.
Or how has the history changed? Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the things that LaRouche used to always be accused of being a wildcat. The Queen of England pushes drugs. And then he said, well, of course, I never said that, but maybe I should have. He went after the British, the Bank of Hong Kong and Shanghai, which was the largest drug money laundering bank in the world, but you weren't allowed to say that either. Do you have more that you want to say in terms of your thoughts on how this attitude affects the electoral process in the United States?
Well, I think there's a sense of pessimism in the country that people have lost control of their government, and that's true. And that's the whole point of having to retake it, and to have the U.S. really live up to what our principles are. Every single war we've been in over the last period, beginning, what happened in 9/11, but the response from Iraq, the weapons of mass destruction, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, now Ukraine, the attacks on Russia, the attacks on China. At each point, this was British policy. And you can see very clearly in their own publications that they were determined that the Americans would play the role of the muscle, as they say, as they set the policy. The question is why the American government goes along with this. And that's the real challenge to the voters, and the kind of thing of having candidacies like what Diane is doing, what people like Scott Ritter did in a different way and so forth, to actually debate out what we want to accomplish, what we want to do as a country, and then make that the focus. So I think, we're really, this thing is a tremendous challenge to the American population. I mean, there are people who are fighting on one level, but we cannot continue to go this way. We have to change these policies. We have to elect people who will be determined to change the policies. And, I think that's really the question. So, the fact that Diane is on the ballot and that, you can see that this is a central question of international politics now. Her campaign and the whole question of the race for the Senate. This is a golden opportunity to raise these questions. And so it has to be done. I mean, we've been deteriorating and moving farther and farther away from our principles. And again, I reference this with Burroughs' book when he wrote it. And he said, why do we not know this? Well, maybe it's becoming, why don't we know about this these policies of torture of the British during the American Revolution? He goes through these different theories of why that may be the case. And then he says, with the last theory, well, maybe it's because we're becoming so like them ourselves. And that was in reference to Abu Ghraib. But this idea of these continuous colonial wars, this is not an American interest at all. It's ridiculous to say that that these are questions of national security. This is in somebody else's interest, and that's what we have to reassert, control of our own government.
Right, exactly. So I think we should draw this to a close. I do want to remind everybody that we intend over the weekend of the 26th, 27th, 28th, I'll just show this leaflet again, to get out 250,000 copies of this in the state of New York. And that means everybody enlisting, and you can sign up at sareforsenate.com to find out how to get copies near you. We will be going to events and fairs and everything we can find where there's large numbers of people gathered or small numbers of people gathered, depending on what part of the state you're in. But we want to have the impact of kind of a shock effect where this goes to into that number of hands in a relatively short amount of time. Also, let me just say here that for those of you who have not given your $2,900 to the campaign this cycle, please contribute. I know many people have been asking for yard signs and palm cards and various things, and all of this costs money. And the more that I raise, the more that we can print. And unlike other candidates, I can assure you that I am not spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on perks, frills, exotic vacations, or people to tell me how to dress, or the other things that candidates spend money on. So when you donate to the Sare for Senate campaign, it is going straight into filling the tanks here. So we're in a real brawl. They made a big mistake. I didn't mention, I think Scott brought it up in the interview. I'm not sure if we heard that part. The Ukrainian hit list has been taken off their website. It doesn't mean that those of us on it are still not targets of these people, but I think it was beginning to backfire, which is exactly the point. It's also worthwhile for everyone watching to call your congressman and tell them they should investigate whether the money that we are giving Ukraine is being used to fund this organization. We know that it is. It's American NGOs and the US State Department who were there in the room. But this is really illegal and they should be called out on it to be funding a foreign agency, which is then meddling in the United States election. We heard a lot about that earlier. And on this Ukraine thing, I just wanted to mention, there is a massive, massive drive to brainwash everybody. I did an interview yesterday with someone with a major news service who mentioned to me that someone he knew was doing a study of how Russian propaganda was spreading through the United States. And so he named a person who I looked up, who's a graduate student, who is a Ukrainian American, Ukrainian, born in Ukraine, graduate student who is a major in disinformation and works at the Brookings Institute. And don't forget, you have Colonel Vindman, who is Ukrainian, who's now, again, as Hillary Clinton did, calling Tulsi Gabbard a Russian propaganda agent. And remember that the owner, I think he's the owner of, or CEO or whatever, of CrowdStrike, the security whatever that was hired by the DNC for their server, is also Ukrainian. So there's an awful lot here which is not known, but it's very ugly. It is very deeply corrupt. The whole story about Hunter Biden and his laptop, remember that? Even the New York Post was banned from Twitter. Last week we had CBS having to take down a documentary about Ukraine merely because they interviewed someone who said that 70% of the weapons we're shipping over there aren't really getting into the hands of the people we're sending them to. And remember, Rand Paul was denounced by Chuck Schumer exactly for saying there should be an inspector general to audit this. So they have good reason to be fearful. More and more people are waking up. We have to really escalate. I think people will wake up. But the question is, will it be in time to avert a terrible disaster? And that's really the fight here. So I'd like to thank everybody for watching. I'd like to say hello to Jeff Young, who is commenting and is on there from Kentucky. He's the Democratic nominee in the 6th Congressional District in Kentucky. We have a chance to do something going into these elections and breaking the blackout. So donate to SARE for Senate and sign up to get your leaflets, and I'll see you soon.